And following now on all of those presentations, we'll have a questions and answers session here. First of all, Katrina Crowe, can I ask you, land was central, the President emphasised that, as many other speakers did, but the Land Commission records, for instance, which you mentioned, are not available now. They are a treasure trove, hugely important. They are public records, and they ought to be available.
They certainly should be, John. It's been a bone of contention since they were rescued from the back of what is now the Marion Hotel back in 1992. At that point, they were transported under very difficult circumstances to the National Archives building in Bishop Street, and thereafter they went down to a warehouse in Portlaoise, where they still are. And repeated attempts by scholars like Dr. Terry Dooley, who is extremely interested in the land question, have failed to get the Department of Agriculture, who are the legal entity who have control over these records, to release them. It is at this point illegal to have them not available. In ways, I suppose, we can account for it a little by the fact that the National Archives Act is relatively new, 1986, but still, I'm hoping that perhaps it is partly as a result of the discussion we're having today, and that there'll be a resurgence of interest in getting them out there.
Registry of Deeds would be another.
Archives are the Registry of Deeds and the Land Registry.
Yeah.
The Land Registry in many ways is more important because that is completely closed, but that archive contains the instruments of transfer of land, largely between parents and children, and they're very revealing about what is allowed to the older people in the house when they hand over to their son or.
And they'd be especially suited, and in fact the only way they could be handled would be digitally, wouldn't it, by
it's not
online,
the only way,
online,
but it would be a much better way.
Much better way,
It would make it more accessible. Same with the Registry of Deeds, which goes back to 1708, so covers a very long period of time. So it's something we've ignored. These archives really would change scholarship on the whole issue of land ownership, transfer, possession, dispossession, the arrangements that were made in the new state.
They would tell us so much more, wouldn't they? President Higgins, you'd be supportive, obviously, of that initiative.
Very much so. I think it's just so important. The Land Commission as well in relation to developing the history of the land and land ownership, not just for the people involved, but also the sizes and the changes in sizes of holdings and what is happening. I'd say absolutely. I think it would be so valuable. I would strongly support what Katrina is saying, yes.
Yeah. Margaret.
If you recognise that the Land Commission from 1881 was initially setting what they called a fair rent, which was believed to be interfering in the status of property, which is why Tories objected to it, and then subsequently by the early 20th century involved in the sales, the amount of social history contained in these archives is literally transformative. I think their importance, as Katrina suggested, would probably exceed anything that we already have. I mean, it's remarkable.
And I'm reminded of Kavanagh's lines, who owns this half a rood of rock, this no man's land surrounded by our pitchforked armed claims. There would be a lot of history and local history and family history.
Everything, it would be remarkable, absolutely remarkable. I mean, of course, I haven't seen them. So I'm assuming that if the records have been kept properly, as one assumes they have, that there will be this vast tract of material there.
Endless volumes of fair rent registers giving really clear detail about what was going on in different places. As I said, they're almost a replacement for the lost census records of 1881 and 1891.
So it would transform the history of the second half of the 19th century utterly.
Yeah. And obviously that was a period, John Cunningham, I think you mentioned that in a way, because you asked, was there a revolution? Question mark.
Indeed, yes.
And in a way it was the Land Acts and it was the amount of land which had been transferred from tenant to farmer. There's nothing more conservative than a tenant who's become a farmer with 30 acres.
Well, arguably, indeed, yeah. I suppose with regard to the record, to understand the process at the lower level, which is something we must understand if we're to understand the general dynamics. Yes, that this would open up to transform social history, I think, and local history in Ireland. I just wonder if I can ask Katrina, what would it take in terms of the resources that are required? Enormous resources went into making the Bureau of Military History records available.
Not enormous at all. It cost very little, actually. Digitisation has become much cheaper, for example. A lot of the Land Commission records are, as Margaret suggested, in good order already. Yes. They're where they should be in terms of the cataloguing of the collection. It wouldn't take that much, to be honest. It takes the will to do it, as so much more in this country. If somebody had the will to do it, this could be done. And similarly with the Land Commission records, or the Land Registry records. Partly it's because of under-resourcing of the National Archives, who do not have enough staff to take on any of this. The same would apply to another huge cohort of records, the 1926
The reason I was
census.
mentioning digital access is that rather like the census, they're of special interest to the researcher who wants to know what happened at 30 acres.
Yeah, absolutely. Digital access is a tool.
Yeah.
It's a tool for dissemination to a much broader cohort of people than the ordinary paper records, for which you have to come to a repository and visit
You
there.
have to travel.
But it's only a tool.
Somebody has
as
to
we
bring
have,
them out to you and so on, but they're made for digital, in my view.
Let's remember, we have just realised how dangerous digital records are, how easy it is to screw it up.
There is another important point, the important distinction between the agricultural sector and farming. It is the only record we would have of what farming was in all its diversity at different levels of size of farm and different relationships to the farm in terms of labour. From once you go past the lost Land Commission records, you're into discussion of sectors and output, but not of farming. So it's of crucial interest in relation to understanding what the history of Irish farming families and their lives.
On the question of sources, Arnsberg and Kimball, for instance, that you quoted, I mean, that is a repository, isn't it? An extraordinary record. And it's a matter of fact that it was these two American anthropologists who came to Clare and recorded just in time a way of life that was vanishing.
Well, 1934, there's the Harvard study. It's preceded by a physical study that there's going on. The expert on it, I think, was probably, I would think, Professor Anne Byrne, a colleague of John's. But, and then they added additional chapters to produce. The Irish Countryman is 1934, the parishes of Luke and Ranamona, and then they add in chapters to give you family and community in Ireland, which appears in the 1960s. The interesting side of it is it's a kind of neat model, but they had consultations with Mr. de Valera. They were facilitated by Bishop Fogarty, and they found a consensus, really, in my view. I've raised some questions about it because the County Clare of that time was, as I have described it in my paper, people were fighting over land. They were horrific about music, about the 1934, the Dance Halls Act. And I think when I went to study postgraduate myself, people would ask you about the Arnsberg and Kimball study. It was the most known, most quoted account of Ireland in anthropology circles for a long, long time.
And a new edition from Clare County Council. It's still in print.
I think that I'd said
so
Professor
important.
Byrne and Tony Farley and Chris Curtin and others who have done very valuable work, I think.
Katrina Clear, can I come to you? Why were women so invisible for so long?
I think one thing that's coming out today is that you'll only find in history what you look for. When you look, you will find people. Linda looked for the records of violence in the newspapers. She found them. I've been looking, for example, at women novelists, writers, essayists, biographers, hagiographers in the 1920s to the 1950s. I've been looking in the newspapers. I've been finding them. They've been published. You know, we all started to ask questions about women in history about 40 years ago in this country because of the feminist revolution, I suppose, if you want to call it that. And therefore, that's what we found. You have to you'll always find it's the questions you ask, really. So I think that's it. We've become more interested in women's participation, women's role, women's mentalities, all that over the past while. And that's why we're finding them more and more. And the more questions we're asking, the more we're finding. And about men as well. A lot of men that we don't hear about, not necessarily working class men, but other male writers that have disappeared as well. So, they're all there.
And do you think fiction now as a source of history, what's your view of that?
Well, I think you have to be very careful using fiction as a source, but I do think it's kind of interesting to see what was preoccupying people in the period. The theme of women having to choose between love and work, or love and their mission to serve Ireland, this was a common enough theme in fiction in Ireland. But of course, the theme of women, strong-minded women, since the novel began, or, if you go back to Jane Austen, any of those novelists, you always get strong-minded women according to the mores of their time in fiction. British fiction around this time as well had this theme of conflict, women being conflicted between love and work and so on. So it shows you Ireland wasn't actually that much different from other countries.
Linda Connolly, on gender-based violence, isn't it also the case that euphemisms will be used, matters will not necessarily be recorded? It's in the nature of the evidence, isn't it, that will be the case?
Absolutely. So some of the cases I've been looking at, I tend to use documents that are very clear as to what happened, but there are a whole range of other kinds of terms. Even the term outrage, for example, is sometimes used, where if it's a first-person testimony by a woman, she might refer to something that happened to her. One of the sources I looked at, for instance, where a girl was being watched in County Tipperary. She was visiting the barracks after work. She worked in a chemist shop, and she describes the manner in which she was searched, having been followed by the IRA. And to me, that reads as a sexual assault, but she didn't use that terminology. Likewise, the terms we use today, sexual harassment, for instance. Again, you can read a report or even some of the witness statements where events are described, and to me, reading that as a contemporary observer, that's what it was, but that was not the language of the time, certainly. And I suppose the agency that women have today, perhaps, in terms of calling out something like that, simply didn't exist. So, having said that, women did have agency, of course. They wanted to have relationships and friendships with men. So there was this tension, I suppose, between the policing of sexuality, which I called it earlier, and then I suppose the choice of women, to engage in relationships or friendships that maybe didn't necessarily fit with the expectations, the social expectations.
And John Cunningham, you mentioned the Irish ecclesiastical record, for instance.
Yes.
That's a mine of information, isn't it, on the mentality of the priest? So, because they had their agony column as well.
Indeed, yeah. And certainly, I think I referred to the mother and baby home specifically, but there are debates going on over months and years about a whole range of social issues, and you can see the differing opinions. Sir Joseph Glynn, to mention another Galway person, was from Gort. He was head of the Vincent de Paul for an extended period. He has quite very interesting observations, which are somewhat at odds with the clerical with the clerical interventions. I think he counsels against placing religious in charge of mother and baby homes, for example, because nobody would go into them if religious were in charge. But we know different now. But I mean, there are these quite interesting and resonant debates. And I think, as I mentioned, in terms of thinking about imagined futures, the future was being very concretely and tangibly being created, really, and planned in the pages of that particular journal, and a number of others as well at the time.
But in terms of women's experience, for instance, I mean, you're saying violence, say, against women, that would be unlikely to find its way into the Bureau of Military History archive, which after all was being collected in the 40s and 51 up to that sort of period, looking back. Yes. So the testimony is 30 years old anyway.
That's right. I'm reminded here of a pension application from, again, another Galway woman, from Athenry. She was married as Mrs. Nelly, again in Gort, but she spoke about being at Moyode in 1916, and there's a reference there. Something happened. She is there with a lot of others. But you just wonder, because she went home, something happened and I went home. So how do you read that in a letter that was communicated 30 years later, when she was justifying her application for a pension, and the something that happened, her abandonment of her station, as it were, in 1916 in Moyode was possibly what was denied.
Did I also pick up from what you were saying, that there was too much in our history of sort of ambushes and the physical force violence, and there's so much more? There are many other layers that we need to be exploring.
Yeah, well, I was trying to make a case for revisiting some of the mass mobilisations, whether they were relating to labour or to agrarian struggle. Specifically in the years that we're talking about, there's the movement from the West, where such movements often emanated in the previous decades, the land seizures around 1920, which created a response on the part of the emerging state, which was quite determined that this must be stopped, because it was creating divisions among the nationalist people, essentially class divisions within agriculture, I suppose.
And Margaret O'Callaghan, partition itself, which came in just...
Could I just pick up on that
yes.
there? You talk about the Irish ecclesiastical record.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose one of the things published there were the quarterly statements of bishops and archbishops during that period. So if we want to try and approach what's thinking about women, one of the ways to look at it is to look at their statements and public pronouncements from the early 20s onwards.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that, first of all, in 1919 and 1920, they're condemning violence. Every individual act of violence is an act of violence. By 1921-22, they're retrospectively sanctioning that which they had formerly condemned. But by about 23-24, they're expressing all this anxiety about a lack of moral probity, a collapse in moral values. And it's mostly focused upon analysing the sexual behaviour of women.
Yeah.
So
if your daughter comes home late from
I think we need to creatively read these sources, I suppose, and look at those sermons and say, what are they really about? You know, they're kind of about violence. Then during the Civil War, they say violence is a degenerating malaise that's come upon.
I can remember just one phrase from a Lenten pastoral. I've forgotten the bishop, but if your daughter comes home late from a dance, lay the lash upon her back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. What he said, if your daughter is home late, leave the lash upon her back. It was the old way and the good way. And the other important part about that is, if you want the reflection, was that as you come, the Irish newspapers, there was a kind of a hierarchy of Lenten pastorals. They were all published.
At great length and in
great
detail.
Length, yes. And Dr. Michael Brown, the Bishop of Galway, as a moral theologian, would very often lead off the week. And it's in one of his that you have that phrase about leave the lash upon her back. And I think.
So, how many questions then, how many layers have we opened up today? Gender, class, and land. They're very, very big issues, and they remain a lot of work for scholars to continue doing. Isn't that the case? Katrina, are you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, as an archivist, this is all grist to our mill, or should be. The more that archives can be made available, that people can consult. And I'd like to make a little bit of a protest for in defence of the Bureau of Military History, because one of the interesting things they did, and you made the point, John, and you're perfectly right, they are some decades after the events they're describing and therefore have to be treated with caution. But one of the things they asked people to do is ask them about their ideology. How did they get involved in the nationalist movement in the first place? All of that is fascinating information that isn't to do with ambushes and shootings and all the rest of it. There's a lot more to the Bureau, and particularly to the pensions files, than simply the accounts of engagements that took place.
Them, really,
it really is a question of how you interrogate the material. A lot of it is online now, which means you can search it in all kinds of different ways, and that allows for endless, I think, interrogation. There is, I always describe the pensions files as sort of shadow social history of a certain part of Ireland during the 20s, 30s and 40s, because you get details of poverty and ill health and all of those things that don't come to us in any other way. Yeah. So I think they're very useful. That does not in any way mean that the land records aren't badly needed. They really, really are. Nor does it mean that exploration of the local newspapers is not a fantastic endeavour, and far easier now that they have been digitised, that you can search those in a way that you couldn't before.
Some of those local journalists they were sometimes known as penny a liners from Condra.
Yeah.
This was because they were paid a penny a line, so that's why they wrote at such great length and gave detailed exposition. They were many times they were stenographers rather than reporters, but that is now to our advantage since we have the record.
Oh, I do think that there are huge omissions that we haven't gone near yet. For example, the whole history of what I would like to say, the people in the cottages. And if you look more than it isn't just the bishops who were suggesting that the society was falling apart, and it was mostly on a basis of sexuality. There was a very strong support in parishes and from voluntary organisations and others who were supporting very, very much this notion. And when you actually look at the newspaper accounts, it's directed against the people who are the lower income people who are, for example, casually employed. And you have the phrase again and again. And it's a very interesting lesson for Ireland in the present time about its inability, for example, to even achieve the notion that of an equality in relation to housing. It is about the phrases that were used about the people in the cottages. And it's but one thing, and not to just be pessimistic about it, isn't it? You might well ask, historians might well like to investigate, at what point in Ireland do we decide that building large housing estates was somehow or another the wrong thing to do? It is to the great credit of that. I think that 50,000 labourers' cottages were built between the 1880s and 1920. Then you move on to the urban housing and so forth. And this is what you don't really hear, is that these people were deeply committed to education and to making the country work. And they're very, no more than, as I said, the graziers capturing the renting of the land. Another class in Ireland had captured the professions. And it is the people who actually came through this public housing and so forth, getting the right to have education for the first time, or going into the professions. So the class element in it is quite, the omissions are very serious.
Right. Can I finally ask you then, President Machnamh, its next phase?
Well, we will publish the proceedings of the first three now with it, and it will include the discussion that came after in each case of Machnamh 1, 2, 3, and Machnamh 4 is organised. It will deal with settlement schisms and civil strife. Professor Diarmuid Ferreter, Professor Mary Daly, Professor Fergal McGarry, Dr. Dahi O'Coron, Dr. Margaret O'Kelleher in November. And then I hope to have 2 next year, so that will be 6 in all. And the two next year, I think that the next one will probably very much deal with the Civil War, deal with that period. And then as I go into next year, really the formation of the states that emerged afterwards. And so we have 3 completed, we will, another one in November, and 2 next year.
Thank you very much.
And my hope, this is the next 3, we will have audiences and we'll be able to be out of our present
Post-COVID.
cloud of restrictions.
May I thank you, President, for the invitation to chair, and also thanks to our speakers today, to John Cunningham, Linda Connolly, Margaret O'Callaghan, of course, Katrina Crowe and Katrina Clear. And that concludes our discussion today and the 3rd session of Machnamh 100. I hope that you found it stimulating and thought-provoking. The President is on record as believing that the latter years of the decade of centenaries, encompassing the treaty divide, civil war and the embedding of partition, will prove among the most challenging of this decade of centenaries. And it is these centenaries which fall next, of course, in the calendar. And the next seminar in this Machnamh 100 series will take place in November. It's entitled, as we've heard, Settlements, Schisms and Civil Strife. It include contributions from Diarmuid Ferreter, Mary Daly, Fergal McGarry, Dáithí O'Coroyne, Margaret O'Kelleher. Please join us then. Further details of how to watch will be available closer to the date on the President's website, president.ie, and on rte.ie. Indeed, all 3 Machnamh 100 sessions are available on these platforms, president.ie and the RTE player. Thank you for joining us at this session, which came to you from Áras an Uachtaráin.